Hi, I'm Jay Freeborn. I am a New York City Apex Art Fellow, and I was outbound to Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. I found that my experience of the program was uh, different from what I expected, only in that I didn't know what to expect. I was interested in going in with relatively little knowledge and experience, which I know is the focus of the program. And I think that that was an exciting way to dive in. The activities presented a variety of challenges. Uh, I don't think that there were any that were challenging because of the nature of the activity itself, but more so my experience of it, um, or how I conceptualized of it. Uh, for example, I attended a meditation meeting, which ended up also being an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, and I felt personally that that was not an appropriate space for me to be in because I'm not a person who's in recovery. And though Alcoholics Anonymous is open to everyone to observe, I don't think I communicated effectively with the folks at the meeting initially, that I was there just to observe. So that was a good learning lesson for me. Also about culturally how to enter spaces in Vietnam, with introductions or without introductions. I realized after the first week or so that many classes or events that I was going to, they did not have initial introductions in the way that I've come to expect Americans often do things. Folks will ask your name, folks will introduce themselves, tell you a little bit about the experience. I think the assumption with Vietnamese folks was they know what they're getting into and they just come to do an activity. Um, but sometimes I wasn't totally sure what I was walking into, and I assumed going there that I would get a little bit more of an introduction. But I don't think culturally that was the norm. So something like the Alcoholics Anonymous meeting or some of my first classes that I ended up doing helped me understand that, and then let me know that I should be taking the lead on something. In thinking about my discomfort with or without certain things throughout the fellowship, I think there are relatively few things in some ways that make me uncomfortable. Like I'm relatively interested or open in doing things. Um, Something like the improv lesson that I ended up having to do, that was uncomfortable in part because I'm not very good at improv. So the discomfort was more like I have to sit with that I'm not very good at something as opposed to the activity itself. With the AA meeting, because I professionally am a social worker and a therapist, I had a professional concern related to that and related to people's confidentiality and boundaries. But I recognize that that is also my assumptions, bringing that into a space that is moderated, not professionally, but by someone who takes on the burden of confidentiality or not, and has the choice to eject people or not from a meeting. So my discomfort was particular in that sense. But overall, there were very few things that I think sat with me throughout the fellowship or after as being particularly uncomfortable for me. There were things that made me think about certain things culturally. There were things that I found physically tiring, um, but very little that I think felt uncomfortable in the broadest sense. For the most part, I was trying to go in without preconceptions, but because there was such a stark divide socioeconomically throughout the city and socioculturally between expats who were working in the city and Vietnamese people, and also to some extent very wealthy Vietnamese people and everybody else. By the time I had had a few activities in the neighborhood that most expats and the very wealthy lived in, I was somewhat trepidatious of further activities there because I assumed they would be with predominantly expats. And I had a sort of sense of what that particular group of people constituted in Vietnam. And they were not necessarily people who I was super interested in learning more from at that point by the third week or so, or speaking further with. But when I had a volunteering activity that was through a dog rescue run by an Australian woman, I was so pleasantly surprised that she was so knowledgeable about the community, was super community engaged, and talked about her own experience of learning and unlearning biases that she had about Vietnam through doing the work that she was doing with animals. Um, there are a lot of stereotypes about Vietnamese folks and animals, also dogs in particular, because dog continues to be part of Vietnamese cuisine in some areas. And so I was just prepared for um, feeling like I wasn't on the same page with the organization before I went to volunteer. But overall, it was a fantastic experience. And I think it's a really thoughtful organization. Coming to Ho Chi Minh City, I spoke no Vietnamese, and I realized quickly that almost everyone speaks some English. English is a very uh, privileged language there, in that it's the second language that's taught in all schools. Um, Other languages like Chinese or Japanese are pretty distant seconds. English is the standard language of business. It's considered uh, a core skill that almost all Vietnamese people who want to be upwardly mobile uh, should attain. So I went to a number of language learning classes and clubs, and everyone was very eager to try and work on uh, English, and particularly English related to transaction and business. The conversations that I had for the most part with people, even people for whom English was like, they were very fluent, were mostly related to business, studying, work, effort. Towards the end, I was able to connect with some people who were more in the arts and political worlds, but for the most part, it seemed like it was a language experience. For the most part, it seems as though English is a language that people learn explicitly for practical and business purposes. It is not a language of culture and art to them. Although people like watch a lot of American TV shows, they also watch K dramas and Chinese movies and Japanese films and things like that. But there's so much censorship that not everything can come through on the US end. So even sort of mentioning certain like English language, like major, what I would say cultural touchstones, those were not always known in Vietnam. So yeah, it was an interesting experience of a certain type of English. It was an interesting experience to have most of my conversations be around business and education, and in particular, hustle culture, because even though that's a part of everyone's daily life, and I certainly think about money, I certainly think about how to better myself financially or in terms of my career. And I also went back to school a few years ago to get a master's degree that would help me um, change careers. So these are not like foreign conversations to me. But what was mostly foreign was the emphasis in particular on hustle culture, which is something that maybe as someone who's in their mid 30s, I'm a little less familiar with, because part of what young people in particular would talk about was personal branding. And many people who worked in hospitality, who were a lot of folks that I was speaking to, were very interested in continuing to work in hospitality, and they enjoyed that a lot, but also were very aware of how to go viral, how they could attract followers to themselves or to their businesses. And I don't have social media. I don't think about those things particularly, and they don't particularly interest me, but I recognize that they constitute a huge amount of how people feel they can move up socioeconomically, particularly in a very competitive market like Southeast Asia. It was my sense that Vietnam is dominated by seemingly like one Vietnamese mega corporation, and that it's not hugely easy for Vietnamese people to start and create and build their own businesses. That much of those successful businesses comes from outside investment. And that people, when they are young, they are interested in working for what they call international companies. They're not interested in working for Vietnamese companies, seemingly because they don't think that they are succeeding very strongly. I ended up trying to make the most of my time alone by exploring the city and wandering around. Um, People do not walk most places in Vietnam, and they really don't take the bus. The government is making a big push to try and move towards green energy. Ho Chi Minh City just opened half of a subway line, and they have a very ambitious plan for the rest of their subway line. But for the most part, people drive around on motorbikes. So me walking around was relatively unusual, and me taking the bus to places was relatively unusual. But I was trying to just explore things uh, and get a sense of the lay of the land from the ground, which is very easy to do in New York. I am pretty used to being alone, so I generally enjoy it. I also enjoy traveling alone. So I found my unstructured time was pretty easy to fill. I was interested in finding out additional things other than what the fellowship was pointing me towards, and I would go and do those. I imagine that my experiences in the fellowship will shift my experience in my community through thinking about what a society understands to be an acceptable level of social deprivation. I work in Brooklyn Criminal Court, and I generally work with people who have been deeply isolated through structures of law, through their assumed criminality, through racial and socioeconomic uh, structures. And Vietnam, as an emerging nation, also has very deep socioeconomic divides. And poverty in Vietnam looks very different from poverty in America, but there are certainly things that are shared there. And I want to think more deeply about what the shifted project of Vietnamese communism has become. I hesitate to say it's failed because Vietnam is ostensibly still a communist country. It has, however, shifted essentially to democratic socialism, because it engages in uh, uh, strong capitalist markets. But what the quote unquote like social project of Vietnam constitutes for Vietnamese people and the Vietnamese government, and how that government does or does not take care of its citizens, how the citizenry does or does not take care of people who are experiencing deprivation either through sort of the standard machinations of capital, or through the explicit fallout of the Vietnam War, the Chinese border wars, consistent colonial involvement in Vietnam. Those are things that are not factors in America, in our poverty, but they are in Vietnam, and how a government does or does not respond to those things. So those are things that I want to try and think more about and bring into my work as a social worker, and what solutions or not I'm trying to envision for the city government of New York, what my city could be doing better, and what my city does well already. So I want to think about that. That is relatively related to my practice as well. I am, in general, interested in the tension of the cognitive dissonance of abundance and deprivation. I'm interested in those things in my practice. So it was another view of a world that was both similar and starkly different to mine. I would say for future fellows, to try and utilize your community contact as much as possible. Those folks, my community contact in particular, had previously been an Apex Art Fellow. I don't know if that's the case for everywhere, but she was very knowledgeable both about her city, but also about the experience of being a fellow. Um, I would tell other fellows to try and, utilize the resource of therapy that they have. Try to keep in contact with folks at home if that also supports them through periods of, feeling lonely or homesick or overtired. Anything that can try and re-regulate you in amongst the pace of the city where you are, or whatever you are doing for Apex. Because I think you do want to, as much as possible, be present for the experiences that are curated for you. Some of them can be demanding, some of them are not necessarily, but all of them deserve your presence. Thank you.